All right, let's talk about something that's really shifting in the Canadian business world. We're talking about the corporate role in Indigenous reconciliation. And look, this has moved way past being a nice to have on a corporate social responsibility report. It's becoming absolutely fundamental to how business gets done in Canada. So today, we're going to break it down: the history, the core principles, and most importantly, the practical steps your organization can take to actually get this right.
160 years. Let that number sink in for a moment. That's where this story really begins. Because that's how long Canada's Indian residential school system was in operation. I mean, it's a staggering amount of time, right? Stretching all the way from the 1830s deep into our modern era.
And behind that timeline is a number that represents the human scale of it all. At least 150,000. That's how many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were forcibly taken from their homes, from their families, and sent to these schools. You know, it's easy to see a number, but every single one of those represents a child, a family, an entire community whose world was turned upside down.
Okay, so you might be asking, why are we starting with this heavy history? What does this have to do with my business today? And that's a fair question. The answer is everything, because you simply can't understand the call for corporate responsibility now without first grasping the deep legacy that created this need in the first place.
Just look at that end date for a second. 1996. 1996. That's not some distant black and white photo history. The last federally run school closed its doors when many of us were already in the workforce. This happened in our lifetime. So when we talk about this, it's not ancient history at all. It's our history, and its impacts are absolutely still with us today.
To kill the Indian and the child. I mean, just let that sink in. This wasn't some unfortunate side effect of a misguided policy. This was the stated goal. The whole point of the system was forced assimilation. It was designed from the ground up to systematically erase Indigenous cultures, languages, and identities. And you really have to understand that intent to even begin to grasp the depth of the harm that was done.
And that harm, it has a name. After years of listening to thousands of survivors, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, the TRC, gave it one: cultural genocide. Now that's a heavy term, and it's not used lightly. This wasn't hyperbole. This was the formal, carefully considered conclusion about the true nature and devastating impact of the entire system.
So the TRC didn't just document the past. It also laid out a roadmap for the future. We're talking about the 94 calls to action. And one of them, call to action number 92, speaks directly to corporate Canada. It's not a vague suggestion. It's a clear call for businesses to adopt the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as their guide and to make sure their teams are educated on this history. The expectation couldn't be clearer. Okay, so that's the historical why. It's the foundation for everything that follows. Now let's get into the what. What are the actual guiding principles and legal frameworks that you and your company really need to wrap your heads around to do this right?
First up, we have to talk about UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the most important thing to know right now is this. This is not just some philosophical document sitting on a shelf at the UN. It's being written into Canadian law. It's becoming part of the legal fabric of the country. That means it's no longer just an aspirational guide. It's a standard our laws have to meet, and that creates very real obligations for businesses.
So what does UNDIP actually mean for a business on the ground? Well, it really boils down into a few key ideas. First, self-determination. That means respecting Indigenous governance and their own decision-making processes. Second is a huge one: free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC. Basically, you need their consent before a project affects their lands. Then there's protecting cultural rights, things like language and traditional knowledge, and finally, acknowledging their fundamental land rights over their traditional territories.
And this idea isn't just coming from the UN, it's baked right into Canada's own constitution. Section 35, it's a big one, it recognizes and affirms existing treaty rights. That means these treaties aren't just old, dusty documents. They are living, breathing, legally binding agreements that are protected by the highest law in the land. And that has massive implications for pretty much any business operation.
Okay, let's pause here for a second because the words we use matter a lot. And there's a really crucial distinction we need to make because it's a point of frequent confusion. We're talking about the difference between Indigenous law and Aboriginal law. They sound similar, but they are worlds apart.
So let's break it down. On one hand, you have Indigenous law. This is the law of Indigenous peoples, their own legal systems, their customs, their forms of governance that have existed forever. It's rooted in their communities and traditions. Then, on the other hand, you have Aboriginal law. This is Canadian law about Indigenous peoples. It It was created by the Canadian state to manage rights and crown relations. See the difference? One is about respecting inherent sovereignty, the other is about navigating the Canadian legal system.
Okay, so we've covered the why, that deep historical context, and we've covered the what, the legal frameworks you need to know. Now we get to the part that really matters, the how. How do we take all this knowledge and turn it into real, meaningful action in the corporate world?
Well, it all starts with a total mindset shift. We have to move past this old idea of just consultation and into the world of genuine partnership. What does that look like? It means engaging early, like before you even have a project plan. It means respecting their timelines, not just forcing them onto yours. And it means providing funding so they can actually participate fully. But it's even bigger than that. It's about true economic partnership, joint ventures, indigenous procurement, employment targets, and revenue-sharing deals that create real, shared wealth.
But let's be real. How do you make sure all these great ideas don't just end up as empty words on page 27 of your annual report? Simple. You treat it like any other critical business objective. You measure it. Because we all know the old saying is true. What gets measured gets done.
So what does that look like in practice? Well, you can track the percentage of your staff that's completed cultural awareness training. You can set hard targets for how many Indigenous leaders you have in your company. You can measure your procurement spend with Indigenous-owned businesses. You can track your community investments. These aren't fuzzy ideas, they're key performance indicators, KPIs that turn a vague goal into something you can actually track and achieve.
Look, when you boil it all down, this all points back to that fundamental shift in thinking. This can't just be about ticking a box to mitigate legal risk or to keep a project on schedule. The real goal here, and honestly the biggest opportunity for your business, is to build sustainable, respectful relationships that benefit everyone for the long haul.
And that really leaves us with one final, crucial question. It's one thing to educate your people, to run the workshops, to learn the history. That's a great start. But it's something else entirely to take that knowledge and let it fundamentally transform your company, your culture, your policies, your way of doing business. So the question I'll leave you with is this. Is your organization just going through the motions of educating, or is it truly ready to transform?